A humble fisherman gave $22 to a hungry girl. 18 years later, a luxurious car stopped by his simple house, and someone knocked on his door. Lionel stood at the edge of the bustling market, the familiar scent of salt water and fresh fish clinging to the air. His hands, calloused from years of hauling nets and steering boats, dug into his pockets as he surveyed the modest crowd. Most of the villagers knew him, nodding in his direction as they went about their errands. But Lionel kept to himself. He had always been a quiet man, content with the simple rhythm of his life by the sea. It was late afternoon, and the sky was tinged with a soft orange glow. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. Lionel had just sold the last of his catch for the day and was preparing to head home when he saw her. Sitting alone on a worn wooden bench at the edge of the square, her small frame hunched and trembling, was a young girl. Her clothes were tattered and her hair hung in limp, tangled strands. She couldn't have been older than 10, but there was a hollow look in her eyes that made her seem much older. He watched her for a moment, noticing the way she clenched her tiny fists in her lap, her gaze fixed on the ground. She didn't move, didn't speak, and the passers-by flowed around her like she was invisible. Something about her stillness tugged at Lionel's heart. As he approached, he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest, the shallow breaths that came too slowly. She was starving. He could see it in the paleness of her skin, the way her eyes were sunken into her face. But there was something else too, something that stopped her from begging for help, even though it was clear she needed it. Lionel hesitated for only a moment before he made his decision. He crouched down beside her, keeping his voice gentle. "Hey there," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Are you hungry?" The girl didn't respond at first. She blinked, her eyes darting up to meet his briefly before flicking away again, as if unsure whether to trust him. Lionel's heart ached at the sight of her confusion and fear. "It's all right," he said, slowly pulling a crumpled bill from his pocket. It was all he had left for the week, $22. It wasn't much, but it would get him by until his next haul. "Take this," he offered, holding it out to her. "Get yourself something to eat. You look like you need it more than I do." For a moment, she didn't move. She stared at the money, then back at Lionel, her wide eyes brimming with disbelief. The expression on her face was one of complete shock, as though she had never expected anyone to notice her, much less offer help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached out with trembling fingers and took the money. Her lips parted, and her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Lionel smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "It's no trouble," he replied. He stood up slowly, his knees creaking from years of wear. "Take care of yourself, all right?" She nodded, clutching the bill tightly in her small hand. For the first time since he had seen her, there was a flicker of life in her eyes, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. Without another word, she stood and hurried off into the crowd, disappearing into the throng of people. Lionel watched her go, a strange heaviness settling in his chest. He didn't know her story, didn't know where she had come from or where she was going. But he couldn't shake the image of her hollow eyes, the way she had seemed to fade into the background of the world around her. As he turned and began the walk back to his small cottage by the sea, Lionel felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had done what he could. The $22 he'd given her was a small sacrifice in the grand scheme of things, but it had made a difference, if only for one day. And though he didn't realize it at the time, that single act of kindness would ripple out in ways he could never have imagined. The sun rose and set over the village, casting its golden light across the sea and the narrow streets. Life continued much the same for Lionel. His days were a quiet routine of fishing, repairing nets, and walking along the shoreline. The ocean was his constant companion, its ebb and flow as familiar as his own breath. He had learned to read its moods, the calm stillness of a summer morning, the fury of a winter storm, and it had become a kind of solace for him, a steady presence in his otherwise solitary life. The memory of the young girl crossed his mind occasionally, though not in a way that consumed him. He would wonder where she had gone, if she had found the help she needed, if that crumpled $22 had been enough to get her through. But the world moved on, and so did Lionel. He had done what he could, and he took comfort in that. His own life, however, remained largely unchanged. Lionel wasn't a man who longed for riches or adventure. His father and grandfather had been fishermen, and so had he. He had never strayed far from the village, never sought anything beyond the horizon that stretched before him each morning as he set out to sea. And yet there were moments, especially in the quiet of the evening, when he would sit by the window of his modest cottage and wonder if life could have been different. His cottage was simple, just a small weathered home with peeling paint and a roof that needed patching every few years. Inside, it was sparse but clean. The walls were adorned with old photographs, mostly of his parents and grandparents, with a few faded pictures of the village from decades before. A small table sat in the center of the room, its surface scarred from years of use. It was a house that suited Lionel, a man who had never asked for much from the world. But as the years went on, the weight of his solitary existence began to press down on him. He had never married, though there had been a time, many years ago, when he thought he might. There had been a woman, Catherine, who had once captured his heart, but life had led them in different directions, and Lionel had never found another. Sometimes he wondered what might have been if he had fought harder to keep her in his life. But those thoughts, like so many others, were washed away by the tides of time. Despite his quiet longing for something more, Lionel found a kind of peace in his routines. He was known in the village for his generosity, often sharing his catch with neighbors or strangers who found themselves passing through. He never expected anything in return, nor did he want it. To Lionel, helping others was simply part of life. It was what his parents had taught him, what the village had instilled in him from a young age. Still, every now and then, when he returned from a long day on the water, a sense of restlessness would settle over him. It was as if the sea, which had once given him so much, was now holding him back. He loved the ocean, but it also anchored him to this small, unchanging life. And yet, he couldn't imagine leaving it behind. One evening, as he sat on the small porch of his cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lionel thought again of the girl. He had almost forgotten her face, though the look in her eyes, the gratitude, the desperation, remained clear in his memory. It had been years since that day, and she had likely moved on, her life taking her far from the little village. People came and went all the time. The world beyond the village was vast, full of possibilities he would never know. She was probably living a different life now, one that had nothing to do with the small coastal village or the kind fisherman who had given her a few dollars in a moment of need. As the last light of day faded, Lionel stood and went inside. The fire crackled in the small hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. He sat in his old wooden chair, his bones aching from years of hard labor, and let out a deep breath. His life was simple, but it was enough. At least that's what he told himself as the waves continued their eternal rhythm just outside his door. 18 years had passed since the day Lionel had handed that crumpled $22 to the hungry girl in the marketplace. Life had continued its steady march forward, as it always did in the small coastal village. Lionel had grown older, his once strong frame now a bit more stooped, his hands gnarled from decades of fishing. The sea, though still his faithful companion, was beginning to take its toll on his body. His movements were slower, his back stiffened more often, and the long days on the water felt heavier than they used to. On this particular day, the sky was overcast, with clouds hanging low over the horizon. Lionel was out by his boat, preparing for the next morning's fishing trip. The air smelled of brine and wet wood, and the gentle lapping of the waves provided a familiar soundtrack to his work. His boat, an old weather-beaten vessel, was like a second home to him. He had spent more time on it than anywhere else in his life, and though it had seen better days, it remained sturdy and reliable, much like Lionel himself, As he bent down to tighten a loose knot on one of the nets, the sound of an approaching engine caught his attention. It wasn't the usual sputter of a fishing boat or the rumble of the old trucks that occasionally passed through the village. No, this sound was different, smooth, quiet, and powerful. Lionel straightened up, wiping his hands on his worn trousers, and turned toward the sound. A sleek, black car, the likes of which had no business being in a small fishing village, was rolling slowly down the narrow street. Its polished surface reflected the muted light of the cloudy sky, and it glided to a stop right in front of his cottage. Curiosity piqued, Lionel watched as the car door opened. From inside stepped a woman, tall and elegant, her movements graceful and assured. She wore a fitted suit, the fabric sharp and tailored, her heels clicking softly on the stone path as she approached. Her hair was neatly styled, and there was an air of quiet confidence about her that made Lionel feel as though he was watching someone from a different world entirely. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the modest cottage and the little fishing boat tied up nearby. Then her gaze landed on Lionel, and a warm smile spread across her face. A smile that was somehow familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "Lionel," she called, her voice soft but clear as she stepped closer. "Do you remember me?" Lionel blinked, caught off guard by the question. He studied her face, trying to recall where he might have seen her before, but nothing came to mind. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice gravelly from years of salt air and sea wind. "I don't think I do." The woman's smile widened, though there was something tender in her expression, as though she understood his confusion. "It's Maggie," she said gently. "You helped me once, a long time ago. You gave me $22 when I had nothing." Lionel's heart skipped a beat as the memories came rushing back. The little girl sitting alone on the bench, her hollow eyes, her trembling hands as she accepted the money. He hadn't thought about that day in years, but now, standing before him, was the same person, though she had grown into someone he never could have imagined. "Maggie," he murmured, still processing the transformation before him. The young, ragged girl from the marketplace had become a poised, successful woman. He searched her face for traces of the child he had helped, and as he looked more closely, he could see it, the same determined look in her eyes, the same quiet strength. "Yes," she said softly, stepping closer. "It's me. I've been looking for you for years, Lionel. That day, that act of kindness, it changed everything for me." Lionel was speechless. He had never expected to see her again, let alone like this. The weight of her words hung in the air between them, and as he stood there, taking it all in, he felt something stir inside him. He had always believed that small acts of kindness mattered, but hearing it from Maggie, seeing what she had become, made him realize just how profound that impact could be. As the wind picked up slightly, ruffling the edges of her jacket, Maggie smiled again. "Can we talk? There's so much I need to tell you." Without a word, Lionel nodded, motioning toward his small cottage. As they walked side by side toward the door, the weight of the years between them seemed to melt away, leaving only the connection of that long-ago moment, a moment that had set both their lives on a path neither of them could have predicted. Inside Lionel's small, cozy cottage, the two sat down at the worn wooden table, its surface scratched and marked by years of use. The room smelled faintly of salt and old wood, the fire in the hearth casting a soft, flickering light over the space. Lionel, still trying to process the weight of Maggie's words, watched her closely as she settled into the chair across from him. The transformation from the little girl he had once helped to the poised woman sitting before him felt almost surreal. Maggie smiled as she noticed his thoughtful expression, her hands resting gently in her lap. "I know it's a lot to take in," she began softly. "I'm sure you never expected to see me again, especially like this." Lionel shook his head slowly, his voice rough as he finally spoke. "I didn't. No. I always wondered what happened to you, though. But look at you now." Maggie's eyes softened as she leaned forward slightly, the warmth in her gaze unmistakable. That day, when you gave me the money, it was more than just $22. It was hope. I don't know if you can understand just how much it meant to me. You were the first person who showed me kindness when I felt completely invisible. I've carried that with me ever since. Lionel shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the attention, but deeply moved. I'm just glad it helped you get by, even if only for a little while. Maggie nodded, her expression growing more serious as she continued. It did more than that. After I got some food with the money you gave me, I was found by a local charity. They helped me get into a shelter, and eventually, I was placed with a family that really cared about me. That was when everything started to change. Her voice trembled slightly, the emotion of her words hanging in the air. I stayed with that family, went to school, and worked hard. They gave me a second chance, and I made sure I didn't waste it. Eventually, I built my own company, one that helps kids who are in the same position I was all those years ago. Lionel's brow furrowed as he took in the enormity of her story. The quiet fisherman who had spent his life in the shadows of the sea couldn't quite wrap his mind around the idea that something so small, something he had done without a second thought, had led to this. I'm proud of you, Maggie, he said after a moment, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. I'm glad things turned out well for you. Maggie smiled, though there was a touch of sadness in her expression. I owe so much of it to you, Lionel. I've thought about that day so many times. You didn't know me, you didn't ask for anything in return, but you helped me anyway. And that small act of kindness stayed with me, pushed me forward when things got hard. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling over them both. Lionel's heart was full, though his mind still struggled to comprehend the ripples of his single gesture. He had never been one to seek recognition or gratitude, and yet here she was, living proof that the little things he had always believed in could make all the difference. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. I've been looking for you for years, she said softly. I wanted to thank you in person, not just for the money, but for what you gave me that day. A sense that I mattered, that someone saw me when I felt invisible. Lionel felt a lump form in his throat, and he swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to receiving praise or acknowledgement, especially for something he had done so long ago. I'm just glad I could help, he muttered, his eyes dropping to the table. Maggie leaned forward, her voice gentle. It's more than that, Lionel. You saved my life that day, in more ways than you know. Lionel blinked, feeling the full weight of her words. He had always believed in kindness, but to hear that it had changed someone's life in such a profound way left him speechless. Thank you, Maggie whispered, her eyes shining with emotion. For everything. The old fisherman simply nodded, overwhelmed by the moment. The quiet life he had known for so long had suddenly been touched by something far greater than he could have ever imagined. Lionel sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of Maggie's words. The crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the sea through the open window were the only sounds in the room. He had never imagined that his simple gesture, a crumpled $22 given to a hungry child, would ripple out and touch someone's life so profoundly. His heart was full, but his mind struggled to keep up with the enormity of what Maggie had shared. I don't know what to say, Lionel finally murmured, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. I never thought anything of it back then. I just saw someone who needed help. And that's what makes it so special, Maggie replied softly, her eyes warm with gratitude. You didn't do it for any reason other than kindness. That's why I never forgot you. Lionel looked into her eyes, seeing the sincerity and emotion behind her words. He had lived a quiet life, content in his routines. But hearing how his small act had shaped Maggie's future filled him with a pride he hadn't expected to feel. He wasn't a man who sought recognition, but knowing he had made such a difference touched him deeply. Maggie shifted in her chair, her tone changing slightly as she leaned forward. Lionel, There's something I want to offer you. I know you've never asked for anything in return, but I want to give you something now. You gave me a future when I had none, and now I want to give something back to you." Lionel blinked, unsure of where this was going. "Maggie, I don't need anything from you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm just happy to see you've done well for yourself." Maggie smiled, but there was a determination behind it. "I know, but please, just hear me out." He nodded, leaning back slightly as she continued. "I've thought a lot about this over the years," Maggie said, her voice steady. "You've worked so hard all your life, giving without expecting anything in return. I want to help make things easier for you now. I've done well with my business, and I'd like to give you the chance to retire from fishing. You've earned it, Lionel. You shouldn't have to worry about money or struggle anymore." Lionel's eyes widened at her words. Retire? The idea felt foreign to him. Fishing wasn't just his livelihood, it was his life. He had spent his entire existence by the sea, waking up before dawn to prepare his boat, mending nets with his weathered hands, and feeling the salty breeze on his face. The thought of leaving it behind felt like an impossible notion. "I've been doing this since I was a boy, Maggie. I wouldn't know what to do with myself if I weren't out on the water." Maggie nodded, clearly understanding his hesitation. "I get that," she said softly. "But what if I could give you something that makes it easier? A way for you to still be by the sea, to still fish, but without all the strain?" Lionel frowned slightly, curious but unsure of where she was going. "What do you mean?" Maggie smiled. "I want to buy you a new boat, a more efficient one, something that'll make your life easier. You wouldn't have to work as hard to make a living, and it would give you more time to enjoy life without the worry." Lionel stared at her, stunned by the generosity of her offer. He had never imagined receiving something like this, especially from someone he had helped so long ago. His first instinct was to refuse. It felt like too much, too grand of a gesture for the small thing he had done. But the sincerity in Maggie's eyes made him pause. "You really don't have to do that for me, Maggie," Lionel said quietly. "I'm not sure I could accept it." Maggie's smile softened. "You don't have to make a decision right now. Just think about it. You gave me the chance to build a life for myself, Lionel. Let me do the same for you, in whatever way feels right. You deserve that." Lionel felt a mix of emotions welling up inside him. Gratitude, humility, and a deep sense of connection to the woman sitting across from him. He had spent so many years believing that his life would always be simple, filled with the steady rhythms of the sea. But now, Maggie was offering him a new chapter, one he had never thought possible. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Maggie." Maggie smiled, relief and happiness evident in her eyes. "That's all I ask." As they sat together in the warm glow of the fire, Lionel felt a shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where he didn't have to carry the weight of hard labor alone, one where the kindness he had shown so long ago came full circle. Lionel lay awake that night, staring at the dark ceiling of his small cottage, his mind spinning with thoughts of Maggie's offer. The rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore usually soothed him, but tonight it was as if the ocean itself was whispering questions he couldn't yet answer. A new boat, a chance to make his life easier, to take some of the strain off his aging body. It was a tempting thought, but also one that unsettled him. He had spent his whole life here, tied to the sea. His father had been a fisherman, as had his grandfather before him. It was in his blood, part of who he was. The long days spent on the water, casting nets and feeling the tug of the ocean's currents, gave him purpose. To leave it behind, or even to do it less, felt like giving up a part of himself. And yet the aches in his joints and the weariness that seemed to cling to him more each year told him that maybe, just maybe, it was time to think about slowing down. Maggie's offer had been so generous, so kind, but it was overwhelming too. Lionel had never been one to ask for help. He had always gotten by, even when times were hard. Accepting something so grand from someone, even someone like Maggie, felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. He couldn't deny the appeal of the idea, though. A new boat would change everything. He could still go out on the water, still live the life he knew, but with less hardship, less worry. As the early morning light began to creep through the window, Lionel sighed and sat up. Sleep had eluded him, and his thoughts were no clearer than they had been the night before. He got dressed slowly, his muscles stiff from another long day of labor. Outside, the village was just beginning to stir. He stepped out onto the porch and inhaled the salty air, the cool breeze ruffling his gray hair. A part of him had always believed that this was how his life would be until the end. Quiet, solitary, with the sea as his closest companion. But now, Maggie had come back into his world, bringing with her an opportunity he had never expected. She had spoken of giving him the chance to enjoy life, to ease the burden he had carried for so long. Could he allow himself that? Could he accept the help she was offering without feeling like he was betraying the life he had built? Later that day, Maggie returned, her presence as graceful and kind as before. They sat on the porch, the warm sun breaking through the clouds, casting golden light over the village. Maggie watched him for a moment, sensing the thoughts weighing on him. "I know it's a lot to think about," she said gently. "I don't want you to feel pressured, Lionel. I just want to help in any way that makes sense for you." Lionel nodded, appreciating her patience. "It's not an easy decision," he admitted. "This life, it's all I've ever known. The sea, the fishing, it's part of me." Maggie smiled, her eyes understanding. "I can see that, and I don't want to take that away from you, but maybe there's a way to keep what you love and still make things a bit easier. You wouldn't have to stop fishing altogether. You just have the choice to slow down when you need to." Lionel looked out at the ocean, its surface glittering under the sun. The idea of slowing down, of easing the daily grind, was appealing. He had never really thought about it before, what life might look like if he didn't have to work so hard just to get by. But Maggie's words planted the seed of possibility. "What would I do with all that extra time?" Lionel asked with a wry smile, trying to lighten the mood. Maggie laughed softly. "Anything you want, Lionel. Travel, meet new people, or just enjoy the village you've called home for so long. You've given so much of yourself to this place. Maybe it's time to take a little something back." Lionel chuckled, though his heart was still heavy with indecision. "I've never been good at taking things, Maggie." "You've earned it," she said firmly, her voice filled with the same conviction she'd shown when they first reunited. "You gave me hope when I had none. Let me give something back to you, even if it's just a little more peace in your life." The sincerity in her words touched Lionel deeply. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such generosity, but Maggie's offer was made with the same spirit of kindness he had shown her all those years ago. He could feel that she wasn't trying to change him or take anything from him, only to give him a chance to enjoy life in a way he never had before. "I'll think about it," Lionel said softly, his heart still unsure, but a small part of him starting to open up to the idea. Maggie smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "That's all I ask." That night, Lionel found himself lying awake again, listening to the steady sound of the waves outside. The sea had always been a source of comfort, but now its familiar rhythm seemed to stir something restless in him. He couldn't stop thinking about Maggie's offer and the possibility of a life where things were a little easier. For years, he had lived day to day, accepting his hard work and financial struggles as just part of life. But now, the idea of change, real change, hung in the air, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. His heart was torn. He loved his quiet life by the sea, but there was no denying that age was catching up with him. His hands, once strong and sure, were now knotted with arthritis. The early mornings on the boat, the long hours under the sun, and the constant strain of hauling in the nets, it was getting harder. And yet, there was something about the routine, the connection to the ocean, that kept him grounded. The thought of leaving it behind, even partially, made him feel like he'd be losing a part of himself. Over the next few days, Lionel found himself grappling with the decision. Every morning as he prepared his boat, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like with a new one. A boat that would make his life easier, that wouldn't require so much of his strength. He imagined being able to work fewer hours, to come home before the sunset, maybe even take a day off once in a while. The idea of it was both thrilling and unsettling. Maggie continued to visit him each afternoon, never pushing him, but always ready to listen. They'd sit on the porch, watching the waves roll in, talking about life and everything in between. She shared stories of her travels, of the places she'd seen and the people she'd met. Lionel listened with quiet interest, though he found it hard to imagine himself in any of those distant places. His world had always been right here, on the edge of the village, with the sea as his only horizon. But as the days passed, a small seed of doubt began to grow in his mind. What if there was more to life than the steady rhythm of fishing and quiet solitude? Maggie had found a way to leave behind her struggles, to build a life full of opportunity and purpose. Could he do the same? The thought both excited and frightened him. He had always been content, or so he had thought. But now, with the possibility of something different laid before him, he began to wonder if he had been settling for less than he deserved. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Lionel sat on the porch, lost in thought. The ocean stretched out before him, its surface calm and endless, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads. On one hand, there was the life he had always known, the simple, hard-working existence that tied him to the sea. On the other, there was the unknown, a life with less hardship, more freedom, and maybe even a sense of adventure he had never dared to seek out. Maggie appeared quietly, as she often did, and took a seat beside him. She didn't say anything at first, simply letting the peaceful silence stretch between them. Finally, after a long pause, Lionel spoke. "I don't know what to do, Maggie," he admitted, his voice low and thoughtful. "This life, it's all I've ever known. I can't just walk away from it." Maggie nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "I don't want you to walk away from it, Lionel. I know how much the sea means to you, but you don't have to choose between your life here and something new. There's a way to do both." Lionel looked at her, his brow furrowed in thought. "Both?" She smiled gently. "You don't have to give up fishing. You don't have to leave the village. But with a new boat, you could work less. You'd have more time to enjoy the things you love without wearing yourself down. You've spent your whole life giving to others, working hard. Maybe it's time to take a little for yourself." Her words hung in the air, and Lionel felt a mix of emotions swirl inside him. He had always been the kind of man who put others first, who believed in hard work and quiet sacrifice. But now, for the first time, he wondered if it was okay to want something more, something easier. He turned his gaze back to the ocean, watching the waves as they rolled in, steady and unchanging. The sea would always be there, he realized. It wasn't going anywhere. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to hold on so tightly to the life he had always known. Maybe it was okay to embrace a new chapter, one where he could still be the man he had always been, but with a little less struggle and a little more peace. "I'll think about it," he said again, but this time there was a new tone in his voice, one that sounded just a little more open to the idea. One afternoon, as Lionel and Maggie walked together along the beach, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the sand. The air was cool, and the gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of salt water and seaweed. The two of them had fallen into a comfortable silence, the only sound the steady crash of the waves against the shore. It was in these quiet moments that Lionel often felt the pull of the sea strongest, the same way he always had. But now, with Maggie by his side, there was also the soft hum of something new. Possibility. Maggie seemed thoughtful, as though something weighed on her mind. Lionel could sense it in the way her steps slowed, in the way she kept glancing at him, her brow furrowed slightly. Finally, she stopped, her feet sinking into the soft sand, and turned to face him. "Lionel," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "there's something I haven't told you yet, something I've been meaning to share." Lionel paused, curious. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, as if she was searching for the right words. "What is it?" he asked gently, his voice steady and reassuring. Maggie took a deep breath before speaking again. "You already know that the money you gave me that day helped me get food, and that I was eventually taken in by a charity. But what I haven't told you is that before that, things were harder than you might realize." Lionel's brow furrowed, concern tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had always known that Maggie's life had been difficult before she disappeared from the village, but he had never pressed her for details. Now it seemed she was ready to share more of her story. "When I was living on the streets," Maggie continued, her voice soft but steady, "I was in danger. There were people around me who didn't have good intentions. I was trapped in a situation that could have gone very wrong." She paused, her eyes searching Lionel's face for understanding. "That money you gave me, Lionel, it didn't just buy me food, it gave me a way out." Lionel stood in stunned silence, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He hadn't known, couldn't have known, just how desperate her situation had been back then. The image of the little girl he had helped all those years ago suddenly took on new meaning. His act of kindness, so simple in his eyes, had been so much more than that for her. Maggie continued, her voice growing more emotional. "I don't think I ever realized until recently just how much that moment changed my life. If you hadn't stepped in, if you hadn't shown me that kindness, I don't know where I'd be today. I don't even want to think about it." Lionel's throat tightened, and he felt a lump form in his chest. He looked at her, this strong, successful woman who had come so far, and the thought that his small gesture had saved her from something far worse shook him to his core. He had always believed in helping others, but now, standing here on the beach with Maggie, he realized just how powerful even the smallest act of kindness could be. "I didn't know," Lionel murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea." Maggie smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "I know you didn't. That's what makes it so incredible, Lionel. You didn't ask questions. You didn't judge. You just helped because that's who you are." They stood there in the fading light, the ocean stretching out before them, vast and endless. Lionel felt the familiar tug of the sea, but there was something else now too, a sense of connection, of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had spent years wondering if his life had truly mattered, if his quiet existence had made any difference in the world, and now here was Maggie, standing before him, living proof that it had. "I'm so grateful," Maggie continued, her voice steady once more. "Not just for the money, but for the hope you gave me that day. It's what kept me going, what gave me the strength to find my way out of a terrible situation." Lionel swallowed hard, his heart full. He had never thought of himself as a hero, never considered that his actions could have such far-reaching effects. But now, as he looked at Maggie, he realized that sometimes the smallest kindnesses could make the biggest impact. "You don't owe me anything, Maggie," Lionel said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm just glad you're here, that you're okay." Maggie smiled, and for the first time since they'd reunited, Lionel saw a glimmer of the young girl she had once been. "I'm more than okay, thanks to you." The two of them stood in silence for a long moment, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. And as they watched the day fade into night, Lionel felt something shift inside him, an acceptance of the past, and a newfound peace about the future. As the days turned into weeks, Lionel found himself reflecting more and more on Maggie's story and the decision that now lay before him. The knowledge that his simple act of kindness had saved her from a life of struggle and danger weighed on him, but in the best way possible. It gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. His small, quiet life, lived in the shadows of the sea, had touched someone so profoundly. It was humbling. Yet even with the weight of Maggie's gratitude and the knowledge of how much his gesture had meant to her, Lionel remained torn. The offer she had made of a new boat, a chance to ease the burden of his daily labor, maybe even retire from fishing altogether, was generous beyond measure. But it also stirred something deep within him. The life he knew was tied to the sea, and the thought of stepping away from that, even in part, felt like a step into the unknown. One morning, as he prepared his boat for the day's work, Lionel felt the familiar pull of the ocean calling to him. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft pink glow across the horizon, and the air was crisp with the promise of a good day on the water. His hands moved instinctively over the ropes and nets, each task so ingrained in him that he didn't even have to think about it. This was the life he knew, the life he understood. And yet, the offer Maggie had made lingered in the back of his mind, as constant as the sound of the waves. Later that afternoon, as Lionel returned from the sea, Maggie was waiting for him at the dock. She waved, a smile on her face, and Lionel felt a warmth in his chest at the sight of her. Over the past weeks, they had grown closer, the bond between them deepening as they spent more time together. Maggie's presence had become a comfort to him, a reminder of the kindness that connected them across the years. "Busy day?" she asked, her voice light as she walked up to meet him. "Same as always," Lionel replied with a grin, wiping his hands on a rag. "But a good haul." Maggie nodded, though her eyes were searching, as if she could sense the thoughts swirling in his mind. They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the afternoon settling around them, before Maggie spoke again. "Have you thought any more about what we talked about?" she asked gently. There was no pressure in her voice, only genuine curiosity and care. Lionel let out a sigh, leaning against the edge of his boat. "I have," he admitted, "and it's not an easy decision." Maggie nodded, her expression soft. "I didn't expect it to be. I know how much this life means to you." Lionel looked out at the water, the waves gently lapping against the shore. "It's all I've ever known," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I'm not getting any younger. Some days, I feel it more than others. A new boat, one that's easier to handle, it's tempting. But there's a part of me that's afraid of what it would mean. Would I still be me if I weren't out here every day, doing the same things I've done for years?" Maggie stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You'd still be you, Lionel," she said softly. "This doesn't have to be a choice between keeping your life the same or giving it up entirely. It's about making things a little easier so you can keep doing what you love without wearing yourself down. You deserve that." Lionel felt a lump form in his throat at her words. He had spent so much of his life thinking that his worth was tied to the hard work he put in, the long hours he toiled on the water. The idea that he could still be himself, still live the life he loved, but with a little less struggle, was something he had never considered before. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "I guess I just never thought about it that way." Maggie smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. "You've spent your whole life giving to others, Lionel. It's okay to take a little for yourself now." Lionel looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. Maggie had come back into his life so unexpectedly, and now she was offering him a way forward that he hadn't even known was possible. The idea of letting go of some of the hardship, of allowing himself to accept help, felt like both a blessing and a challenge. "I think I'm ready," he said finally, the words feeling both heavy and light at the same time. "I'm ready to accept your offer." Maggie's smile widened, her eyes shining with happiness. "I'm so glad to hear that," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You won't regret it, Lionel. I promise." Lionel smiled back, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just living day to day. He was making a choice for his future, a future that now felt a little brighter, a little more hopeful. As they stood together by the dock, the sun setting behind them, Lionel knew that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. And for the first time, he felt ready to embrace that change. In the weeks that followed, Lionel's life changed in quiet but meaningful ways. Maggie had kept her promise, and soon a sleek new boat was docked in the place where his old weather-beaten vessel had been. It wasn't extravagant, but it was efficient, sturdy, with new technology that made fishing easier. Lionel found himself working fewer hours, his body no longer aching the way it had for years. He could still do what he loved, but now there was space in his life for more than just hard labor. He spent his mornings out on the water, the familiar rhythm of the sea still a part of him. But the work now felt lighter. With the extra time he had, Lionel began to reconnect with the village in ways he hadn't before. He found himself enjoying slow afternoons, sitting on the porch of his cottage with a cup of tea, watching the ebb and flow of life around him. Neighbors stopped by more often, some curious about his new boat, others just wanting to catch up. Lionel, who had always kept to himself, found he liked these moments of conversation and company. Maggie remained a constant presence in his life, visiting him frequently, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They would walk along the beach, talking about her work and the people she was helping. Lionel marveled at her resilience, her determination to make the world a better place. Every time they spoke, he felt a quiet pride in knowing he had played a small part in her journey. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Maggie turned to him with a soft smile. "You seem different, Lionel. Happier, I think." Lionel nodded, a peaceful smile on his face. "I think I am," he admitted. "It's strange to say, but I didn't realize how much I needed this. You've given me more than just a boat, Maggie. You've given me the chance to enjoy life again." Maggie's eyes glistened with emotion. "You gave me that chance first," she replied quietly. "I'm just grateful I could return the favor." They sat in silence for a moment, the sun casting its last rays over the horizon, the world around them bathed in warm orange light. Lionel felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him. His life, once defined by solitude and hard work, had been touched by something extraordinary. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lionel glanced at Maggie, his heart full. "I'm glad you came back," he said softly. Maggie smiled, her eyes bright. "So am I." The waves lapped gently at the shore, and for the first time in years, Lionel felt truly at peace. His life had changed, not in dramatic, overwhelming ways, but in small, beautiful ones. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the sound of the sea and the warmth of friendship, Lionel knew he had found something far greater than he ever could have imagined. He had found hope. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.